So, as you know, with the whole biotech podcasting, the goal is to make things a bit more legible, and I want to ask a lot of dumb, kind of basic questions about biotech and maybe even biology. And I think it'd be really cool to kind of go through your theses that you've put out about all these different things that we've talked about for the past few months. I have a good sense of them, but I think you're gonna have to explain all of it again from like a more basic POV. But first, how did you get started with biotech? What was your entry path into starting a company and then leaving the company and all of that? How did it get started?
Yeah, I mean, my entry path into I think like the greater field of biology was like undergraduate. Like, I mean, it's kind of like very much like Asian tiger parents of yes, you should be a doctor, and I was like, sure thing. And so, what was the best path to be a doctor is like doing some sort of bio degree. For me, it was like okay, biology. Just doing a basic like biology degree seems kind of lame. So I added the biochemistry on top of it to just make it a little harder, so I felt better about myself. So I don't know, I was a basic bitch back in the day, and I did that. And I did a lot of research. I think it was pretty much like whatever a pre-med student will do, I did. And then I hit my last year of undergrad was also the year that COVID hit, and I actually had to think about like what being a doctor entailed, and it did not sound too appealing of spending like what like investing essentially 10 years of your life to become trained as a doctor to spend like 20 hours a day or like I don't know, maybe less like maybe like 15 hours a day in a hospital. It just did not seem that appealing. And then I also have this like greater thesis that like medical technology is advancing at like such a crazy rate. Like there has to be a tipping point where that finally gets actually adopted into the greater healthcare system. And if you think about your career span as this like really, really, really long-term investment, yeah, like that didn't sound like great if a doctor gets replaced by an AI. It was a very simple thesis back in the day. I think I've developed more nuanced takes on that, but that was kind of the premise of not going to med school. So I wrote the MCAT, decided not to apply to med school, and then I really wanted to figure out what I could actually do with the 4 years of investment I did into biochemistry. And for me, the most appealing thing was actually to trade biotech equities. So I did the most kind of like obvious path, which was like, okay, let's look at clinical trial readouts and see how we can bet on these and also invest in actual like therapeutic assets. I did realize I was not too good at that.
This
It
was
was
contact if you what year was this? This was like 21, right? 2020?
one, I think. Yeah, 21 when this was the COVID boom when like biotech
Yeah.
equities were just ripping. So it wasn't that actually that hard actually. Although I was still playing like therapeutic assets. So I guess I was missing out on the real fun, like investing in like Novavax and like Moderna. But yeah, like that was my kind of foray into like actual biotech as an asset class. Like I was pretty broad, like, okay, like I started with like the most traditional version of it, which was, okay, you are a drug company, you develop a therapeutic, you develop some sort of thing, a medicine that someone can take and they can get a better outcome for their disease. And now we invest in those things. And I've kind of over time when I was investing in that realized that like that is really boring. Like the phase one, phase two, phase three kind of like stage gate thing. It just
Yeah.
felt like really boring. And this was also the time when I was discovering like a lot of like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger things. And I really wanted to apply their like investment philosophies. But I took a really weird way of doing that where I started getting really into growth equities, where I don't know, like I feel like Warren Buffett would really not be proud of me for doing that. But that was kind of the journey. So I started getting way more into like things like telehealth, things like DNA sequencing, DNA synthesis. And yeah, I was starting to look at that. And I think I wanted to build a career around that, but I felt like because I had this sunk cost with like the amount of education I did within like biology and like biochemistry that like I had to find something where my skills were actually more useful. And I felt like I didn't really use my time in like university well to really get like launch a career into like investing. That
Yeah.
was this, yeah. So then
Well,
I
before
started
we
thinking
talk about
about
your company, I had a question. What would be a actual value stock in biotech that Warren Buffett would look at and go, "Yes, that's the one."
yeah, it would have to be something like that was is like really predictable and like cash flow. So it would fall into like the like services slash tooling space, which is I mean something I find actually really
But
interesting.
that's
I started
also
looking at
cyclical, right? But that, as we know, that's also cyclical.
Yeah, I mean Warren Buffett invests in cyclical stuff like actually Ben
Sure.
Graham, I think like he had a letter where he wrote about like wow, like biotech there is some growth here to be seen, but like investing in like these like clinical assets seems like actual shit. He also proposed like yes, you should invest in tooling. Like it seems like if you invested in tooling, you could really capture some of that value without
Yeah.
making these like kind of more probabilistic bets in clinical trials. And he proposed that you should invest in applied biosystems, which is now owned by like Thermo Fisher. But like Ben Graham has thought about this, and he is obviously the predecessor to Warren Buffett. So I'm sure Warren will convert one day.
It sounds like Charles River and rats might be like the only value play that I can think of, and like lab equipment with Thermo Fisher.
Yeah, do lab equipment, something like Danaher too. Like I'm a really big fan of Danaher and the story, but it's really similar. Of like this is
We're gonna get to Danaher. I have a lot
yeah.
of questions about Danaher because you've talked about it so much, and I feel like I don't know anything. Um, okay, so you had the sunk cost fallacy, and then now you started a company. What was the process of starting a VC-backed biotech biomanufacturing company?
Well, the process is you are kind of like hanging out with your friend and you're like, wow, like the everyone's raising so much money in this industry. Like we should really do something. Like it seems like it's very accessible, very easy. And we could start the version of this in Canada. And that was kind of like the premise of like, okay, then let's go rent up some lab space and figure something out. And that's kind of how we started the actual like process of starting a company. It did take a lot of work of like figuring out what the fuck we were actually going to do in the lab and like make a product. But like we were iterating a lot on that. And eventually we came on this like thesis that we should use like fermentation technology because there's a lot of these what we call like alternative feedstocks in Canada. So like we could use that as our quote unquote like competitive advantage of like wow, like we can use the fact that we're in Canada as an advantage. So we kind of thought a lot about that and we ended up pitching that as an idea and then we got seeded by this firm called Axial in well, I guess he's an SF, yeah. So Josh Elkington. He it's kind of funny a story of how I like a part of how I started in the biotech industry was I started reading his like Substack and he does a lot of these deep dives on like therapeutics and platforms. So I do credit him with like actually putting a lot of content out there to get like to increase like the accessibility of this information. But anyways, yeah, like I think for some reason that I put that in the back of my mind, but for some reasons he somehow found me and then we ended up talking and then he wrote a check and we kind of actually got it the started the ball rolling and I guess the rest is history. We spent a lot of time like actually like figuring out still after we got that money of what we are gonna do with it. And eventually over time, like I met like our another like co-founder who kind of like came from the more agricultural industry. And he was the one that kind of thought more deeply of like how agriculture as a system works. And like the specific thesis we ended up landing on was kind of how the plant-based protein kind of industry is structured. And essentially, if you've ever had like pea protein before, like how that works is we grow essentially like 30% of the world's peas in Canada. And a lot of these peas usually they used to get exported, but now like because of this kind of rise in demand for like quote unquote plant-based protein, like a lot of investment was made into this infrastructure that extracts the protein out of these peas. And that's kind of how you get your kind of plant-based protein for your Beyond Meat or whatever. But the problem is that a pea is still a plant, and there's actually not that much protein in it in the grand scheme of things. It's only 20% protein. So our thesis was that we could take that 80% byproduct, use that as an input to some sort of like fermentation process to basically produce protein and then feed
Yeah.
it back to the plant that was basically produce protein. So, it's kind of more like this win-win thing where we basically increase their margin because they are basically in the business of producing protein and they're producing this waste stream that is kind of just like going to waste. And we were kind of like this was the thesis was building offensive technology where like eventually you get to this point where one of these players in the plant-based protein kind of processing industry would have to basically have exclusive ownership of this technology if it actually worked at scale like properly because it would give them a competitive advantage in the market. So that was the thesis and we end up kind of trying to go after that route and spent like 3 years developing the technology for that. All fine and good. We got it working at this basically what I call like a mini pilot scale, but we needed to do another step kind of function upgrade in scale to get to like 1,000, 10,000 liters of fermentation capacity. And then we kind of had to raise money for that to do that because you can't just build your own kind of brewery. So,
Yeah.
but the challenge is that I've kind of when I met Josh, this was kind of the peak of the COVID enthusiasm where biomanufacturing was ripping. Like Ginkgo Bioworks just went public. And like everyone was really happy. But it took me kind of 3 years to use Josh's money to like develop the technology and everything. And by the time I went up to raise money, Ginkgo stock was in the dumps. Biomanufacturing was a hated asset class. Well, like Beyond Meat, I mean, the stock speaks for itself. It is also in the shitters. Like plant-based protein kind of lost a lot of the enthusiasm. So I realized like I couldn't really raise money to do this thing. And I also realized that it was also not that venture scalable of like a kind of play. Like it was like kind of even like when you go back to our original thesis, it was we need to build this offensive piece of technology that could get acquired by a big like agricultural player. And
Mm,
then that was kind of like the kind of strategy. But if you think about that, there's no venture scalable outcome there. We didn't think
yeah.
about our business in the right way, I'd say in hindsight.
What would you have done differently if you knew that you only had, maybe a year or two to raise more follow-on funding before the cycle changed? What would you do differently? Would you like have more less ambitious milestones to where you can go to investors and say, hey, listen, we here's like our end state. Here's these milestones, and one of them, is super achievable. And once we achieve this milestone, we're gonna go raise more venture money, and we're gonna do it at the peak of the cycle or whatever. What would you do differently?
I mean, this is an interesting question because I like in hindsight, I was talking to someone about this yesterday actually, about the fact that there's no like financing vehicle for biotech companies that are developing technology for non-venture scalable outcomes.
Yeah.
And like in theory, like our thesis was always non-venture scalable. So even in hindsight, we
Really?
raised like
Was that an explicit thing that you spoke about beforehand? Because if you take venture money, I mean, implicitly you're kind of agreeing to the venture rocket ship
yeah.
growth type of thing, right?
Yeah, well, see, like the thing is, like the biomanufacturing industry hasn't really didn't really figure that out that well. Like we're building all this like infrastructure. Maybe it was not a venture scalable industry in the first place. So I feel like I was thinking like a lemming, I'd say back in the day, where it's like, okay, everyone is kind of like we got to raise VC money because that's the only money we can raise. But like no
Mm,
one was really building anything that at the end of the day was venture scalable. So like if anything, in hindsight, like I wish I realized that earlier and kind of like thought differently about how I would raise the financing for it. I don't know, like I feel like this is like the problem where it's like you're kind of young and you are really attracted to this kind of like the glorious kind of like venture capital scene where it's like, okay, yeah, if you raise a big round, it's so nice to be able to like, like be a founder, kind of like be backed by all these cool VCs and work on your kind of thing. But like in hindsight, like how would you do that differently? It's like it's really hard to know with the information I have today. Like, okay, the market is turning. Okay, sure. Then in hindsight, you raise a bigger seed round as fast as you can. Be really aggressive with like how you kind of like tell your story. But then you still kind of get stuck where you raise this kind of large seed round and they're eating like a massive part of the cap table. Like, do you take that exit strategy? Like you'd probably still make like barely anything. So I don't know. It's hard to say in like in
yeah.
hindsight.
Yeah, it's a tough question. But something you said about how you were already gearing the company for an acquisition by some other major agricultural company. I feel like that is a mistake. Like if you're trying to start a venture scale company and you have a set outcome, a set goal of being acquired by somebody else, in general, that is a mistake because you're just not going to hit that scale to where you are a valuable enough acquisition. You have to be aiming to be the next big thing. And along the way, you might find it better to get acquired versus you kind of are always aiming for an acquisition. And it was always like this sort of red/yellow red flag I would hear from founders when I was taking all these pitches, like, oh yeah, we're gonna get acquired by this. I'm like, no, you don't know that, and you should be aiming to actually just compete with the incumbent versus try to get acquired. But so this experience shaped your view on venture, and you shut it down, and you started building a thesis around all these distressed opportunities in biotech. Or am I missing something along that timeline?
Well, yeah, I mean, I decided to wind down the business because, like, as you said, there was just so many red flags around the way we structured it. Of like, yeah, like, okay, this is not venture scalable, but we took a bit of venture money, so they're just like this there does not compute. So I was like, okay, and then me and my co-founder started to have like this incentive misalignment where it's like he clearly wanted to move on with his life, and I obviously have a different direction I wanted to take my interests. So it was the best solution for like everyone involved to just wind the business down. So that did that. And so I took a bit of a sabbatical actually to really figure out what I wanted to do. I I started reflecting a lot more on the fact that like, yeah, like I had a friend actually ask me this question of like, yeah, like if you weren't doing what you're doing, like what would you want to do? And it's like, oh, like when I was like building my company and it was like, well, I would actually want to do investing, right? Because like that was what got me started in starting a biotech company in the first place. And it's like, okay, like I should really think more deeper into like how to execute on that. But I didn't think about biotech investing actually. I was just broadly like, okay, I am a disciple of Charlie and Warren, right? Like I think they've taught me a lot about like just like how do you position yourself. And I knew I really wanted to do like investing that other people weren't doing, like things that are kind of like weird. I call it like kind of weird contrarian theses, but it has to be like weird. You're like if you're finding your own pond to fish in, and it can't be like a big pond where everyone else is.
Sorry,
So
sorry. I feel like the weird stuff, like there's somebody there building weird shit all the time now. Like, how do you find that actually weird stuff? Because the venture as an asset class has just grown so much to where you have people, investors in every corner of every industry on earth trying to find venture scale outcomes in fucking mining, like the most niche industries on earth. How do you even determine what's weird and what's not?
that's the thing though. It can be weird, but it doesn't have to be venture scalable. Like there's so many
Oh,
weird things
right.
you could
Yeah.
do. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
That's a
got
good point.
really interested in search funds as a kind of an asset class of like it got really it's been become really hot, but like just like the premise of a search fund was like really cool back in the day. Like things like that, like I mean, I was really interested in a lot of these like basically private equity funds that were doing these things called quote unquote alternative investments where they're like rolling up boat marinas, like collecting like farmer
Oh,
royalties,
right.
rolling like things that are kind of like you don't think of, but like okay, this is a pretty cool business if you're like only like one doing it. I think it was
Yeah.
around that premise that I really wanted to think about like how do I do that. So to do that, I started to just do sabbatical things. Like I went to go to a mine in Ontario to see like okay like mining industry very weird like it's a little more hot now but like at the time it was like okay people don't really care about mining and yeah like that was a pretty cool experience learned a lot about like how the mining industry works still kind of a little interest of mine but yeah then I went
Wh-
to Vietnam
what did you learn about mining that was super interesting?
mining yeah what I learned about mining actually like it's a very labor intensive and capital intensive industry highly cyclical and the way it kind of ends up working is the big guys will end up eating any small player so it's a pretty hard industry to just like break into, and it depends on a lot of incentives that are kind of out of your control. Like it's like the mine I visited, for example, like there was a massive political backlash when essentially they're owned by this parent company called Vale, which is a Brazilian company that is 50% owned by the Brazilian government. And there
Oh,
was a lot of
wow.
political hoops that needed to be jumped around to get that Vale acquisition done in Ontario because it's Canadian land and they're owning basically Canadian assets. So it was interesting to learn about how like this got me interested, really interested in this idea of field research though, of like getting into the weeds because like I'm like in the mine talking to with the miners, talking with like the people that work there who obviously fucking hate the parent company, which is always really interesting. Like there's a very much difference between the labor class and the actual management class. And it was really interesting seeing that play out in an actual mine where like everyone is kind of just like there to make the bag. The like people there are clearly don't like where they are, but like they pay well enough because you're in the middle of nowhere in Ontario that like it's really attractive. It was really interesting just actually being in the mine and talking with the people that it was more like I think that taught me experience of like really need to do field research versus like reading all these headlines on like Bloomberg. Like that is cool, but you don't really understand how the system actually works. How like for example, something I found really cool was that once they shut down the mine, they don't actually take the shit out of the mine, like all the equipment, everything. No, they don't give a fuck. Like they will just flood the mine and then that's the closing of the mine. Like they do not care. Because like the capex it takes to pull your equipment back up is more than actually just like flooding it. So that was like there's a lot of like interesting things about how
Whoa.
those work. Yeah, like it's really interesting. Yeah, and the equipment really cool. Like I feel like if you've ever read like The City of Ember, like a mine is exactly like the City of Ember, where it's just like
I
it's almost like
haven't.
this it's almost like this kind of like own like civilization underground where like they have like these mechanical shops, they have these like rest stations. Like it's just like there's a system that works like in its own place and you can kind of like enter there's only one place you can enter and exit into it. And this it's called the what do you call it? The cage. Yeah, the cage where you go in the cage, you get dropped like essentially like 100 feet under the ground and you just get into it. So it was was a really surreal experience, and I'd definitely do it again. But I did not come out of that with any unique insight or thesis I could really act on.
Yeah.
Maybe if I dug a little deeper, I could have captured the current mining boom, mineral boom, but I definitely was not thinking deep enough then.
I mean, there's definitely like public equities plays you could have made, right? If you got a little creative around it.
Yeah, like the core insight I got was more around nickel. Like it was like there was a lot of contracts being locked up, but this is during the EV craze where like Tesla had
Yeah.
a bunch of contracts with the mine. I don't think they were supposed to tell me that, but then I don't know. It was like, okay, very cool, but this is very obvious. Like if I thought more about like rare earths and like, oh yeah, like let's get like looking at these rare earth mines because like every mine is obviously producing a different mineral and they obviously have a different understanding of where that mineral goes into. Maybe there's something interesting there, but yeah, that experience, I mean, they got me really into like industrials as an asset class. And I did put on a small uranium trade during my time kind of looking at mining assets because I did think there was like a uranium play to be made, although I didn't time the cycle correctly. So that was kind of something cool that came out of that.
The little I understand about mining really does remind me of drug development in biotech, where you have a big, huge capex cost around building out new mines, and you have all these various funding mechanisms to kind of search for new mines, and then it's like finding a target, in a drug development, and then huge costs around development, and that may or may not pan out based on the more you dig, the more equipment you put in. The parallel seemed like I spoke with Akira about it, and he was telling me, and I was like, "Oh, this sounds so much like biotech."
It is actually, I think that is a valid point. I think it's like a less sophisticated version of biotech where like mining barely uses any technology. Like it's funny, like there's a story of, I forgot what it's called, but there's this company called like Tech Resources and like they got their start because the founder found this like massive ore body that everyone missed because they just drilled the wrong way. They just drilled the drill cores the wrong way and they just completely missed the ore body. And
Yeah.
then their discoverer the person that discovered the ore body they drilled the right way and they just found it and it's just like and they use a bit of technology obviously to actually find it like they were flying planes with like I forgot it was like this like military technology that could like actually scan the landscape and they found like okay we should maybe drill here but it was still like it's very unsophisticated of like how that industry works but it does involve like these massive like capex projects that like are really hard to execute on and it's like it is like the parallels are pretty similar.
Yeah. Give me 1 second. I'm just gonna upgrade the thing here. It prompted me to pay pay Zoom.
Fucking
I'm just
Zoom.
gonna uh
My Zoom guy's been letting me down too. I have to fucking harass it.
oh yeah, your bootleg Zoom. Vietnamese
Yeah.
Zoom.
Yeah, the fucking Vietnamese Zoom fucking I might need to start a new account because I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, I'm gonna bite the bullet and just start paying.
Just pay for a month and just like figure out like an alternative solution.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, great. I should.
Insane. Insane.
Okay, whatever. Now we're done. Um, one last thing about mining before we move on. When I was talking to Akira about it, I asked him, what are these people? What are these people mining? He said, "Oh, they're mining gold," and I couldn't help but think about crypto, where the mid-curve take back in the like 2017, 2018, whatever time period was, go invest in Bitcoin mining companies. They will do really well because they're basic infrastructure to mine Bitcoin. But you know what would have been way better than buying Bitcoin mining companies? Buying Bitcoin. You would have outperformed everyone, including the companies, including every hedge fund manager on earth, if you just bought and held Bitcoin. And will that be the same with gold? Like I was like, Kira, why don't you just go buy gold? Like why buy gold mining companies when you can just buy gold? He didn't have a great answer to that. He's like, I would have to think about that. I don't know. But the answer is probably around just like, different risk reward profile, like reliable cash flows, all that stuff. But I don't know.
This is a
Would
good
you?
question because I bought the Bitcoin mining companies,
There we go.
and it did not perform as well as Bitcoin, so you are right. But my uranium trade, I did buy spot uranium, and the uranium miners have been doing a lot better. So I feel like
Hmm.
there's no answer. Yes, I don't know how to think about that actually. Like
Why is
it's
that?
really
Why are the uranium miners doing better?
I don't know. It's like because like the market can almost get ahead of itself of like we see like uranium might like I don't know, like say like the price might like really rapidly increase and therefore we'll buy the equities. But then I don't know, it's kind of like how I guess how the system works of like okay, when the like stock price of a uranium miner goes up, they can invest more into actually starting a uranium pro actually no, because it takes like 10 years to actually get a uranium mine off the ground. I need to think more about like how my uranium trade is panning out still.
There's probably the answer is probably something to do around the reflexivity of like a digital native asset versus versus a hard asset like uranium or gold, where you simply do not have the internet-based reflexivity baked into the asset price. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe yeah, I don't know. Anyway, you went to the mining rigs and then you started thinking more about biotech.
Yes and no, actually, I'd say. I mean, I was always interested in biotech more in terms of how you can like exploit like inefficiencies. But I'd say like after my mining arc, I still like was really interested in industrials and I still am. And that's kind of where I got really into emerging markets actually. So I went to Vietnam for like a bit
Yes.
just to do my little, I was really curious about this. I've been always really like a fan of China. Maybe it's Coke because I'm Chinese, but it was like, okay, like China has really, I mean, it's a pretty great story. Like they brought like a lot, like half their population out of poverty. Like that's pretty impressive. Maybe more than that. Actually, I don't know
Yeah,
the number,
yeah.
but like it's a great story, and the way they did it was through manufacturing, and just like this amazing story, really cool. And I feel like I missed out on it, and I was like, okay, cool. Like the narrative around Vietnam was like this is going to be the next China. A lot of this manufacturing is moving to Vietnam, and I was like, okay, cool. Like let's go fucking do some field trip. So I went to Vietnam and wanted to check out a lot of the like manufacturing infrastructure to see if I could again figure out if there's a cool thesis to be had there. It was more like a really this is really interesting and emerging markets work in a very weird way. Then I have a unique insight here. So
Oh, and worth mentioning that your girlfriend's Vietnamese and that helped.
yes, that helped. Maybe everything is just connected in code, but yes, that is probably the source of how I got a lot of these plugs of
Yeah.
see how yeah, I don't think if I could just roll up there and I could actually just walk into these places. But yeah, that was the story. Yeah, I went to Vietnam. Then I guess yeah, I came back. Coming back was actually the big kind of like I think turning point for me because it was like okay, like I'm really interested in weird theses because that was the whole point of all these trips, right? Like it was like okay, I'm doing a lot of this like field research because I'm trying to develop a really unique take on the market and how do I do that? So that's when my friend actually, our mutual friend actually, Aishwarya was like, you need to write more. And I was like, cool, like bet I will write about weird alternative theses. And before I went on my like little sabbatical journey, I was already building this thesis around distressed biotech IP because of my kind of experience shutting down my company of like, oh yeah, like you can be this cool venture backable story and you can invest all this money into kind of like building your technology, but you can still go out to scale in your venture scalable market and you can fail.
Yeah.
And kind of like I'd say like it was a little bit of kind of trying to cope about like what position I was in, but it was like I think there are a lot of similar stories to that where people raise money and but they still have to invest it into developing like this really beautiful technology that's really elegant, but the market is not as elegant and like markets are punishing and if they fail, like they don't really have a second shot. But a lot of this technology like could be used in like really different weird kind of like this is good where the weird part comes in where like I was like there are a lot of like weird applications for really advanced technology. And like the my case example that I always thought about is like how like a lot of drug encapsulation technology can also be used in like encapsulating like cannabinoids in like fucking like some sort of like drink, like these like
What are
those like we
cannabinoids? So what'd you say?
Weed. It's the
Cannabis.
Yes, the cannabinoids are the active ingredient in weed.
Cannabinoids.
Yeah.
Ah, okay, okay, okay,
Yes.
okay.
Yes. This is my case in point of like, yeah, like if you own like this like advanced drug like, encapsulation IP, like you can use it to encapsulate like anything you fucking want. Like, and why don't you just
Mm,
encapsulate fucking weed? Like that is a big industry. I mean, it's a big industry, but it's not a venture backable industry. And it was just like, damn, the thought process, like there are a lot of these like cases of just like there are these like weird kind of like middle size, medium sized industries that like you could really like take this IP into if you're like creative and you have a creative mind. That was kind of like the genesis of that idea. But
yeah.
yeah, that was the thought process of that thesis. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like we can talk more about the way you would go about doing it, but it's so operations heavy, right? You would have to roll up all of these different assets into one company and then figure out a way to monetize it. Why don't you talk more about like the Danaher example? What is Danaher and like why is it important?
Yeah, well, the inspiration before that idea was through like companies like Danaher and then this other one called TransDigm. But like Danaher, I think is a more interesting and replicable example because they kind of pivoted into life sciences where they are today. But they're this example of a company that is just a serial acquirer. They acquire businesses, and then they have this thing called the Danaher business system, which they use to operationally improve these businesses. So it's kind of like this like private equity holding company, but the inspiration was that this company is like this really powerful company because they just own these assets that they just like are really good at running. And they kind of like are basically the picks and shovels of basically the biotech industry actually now today. But like it just like they've done this like really well. And I kind of was combining that concept with like this other company called TransDigm, which is like this holding company that owns a lot of this like random like IP that goes into like the airplane industry. The thought process there for like why that business is so kind of like interesting is like they would own like the IP around like a seatbelt buckle or like an airplane screw, which is like they're kind of like spec'd into an airplane where you can't really change that piece of IP because this is like $100 million Boeing 747, right? So you're not changing that IP. So they can mark up that piece of IP however they want. So that got me really interested in this idea of like there is like a lot of I'd say value, but also like an advantage towards like holding like a portfolio of IP combined with a more like a Danaher kind of thought process of like you can really operate this IP really well in a lot of these like interesting like categories and industries where like you are kind of like this like yeah picks and shovels type of play. Like it was a very like nascent idea of like how do I replicate the Danaher, like how do I
Yeah.
build another Danaher but using
How,
a kind of like a more Transdime like approach.
how did Danaher get started? I feel like that is the hard part here.
Yeah, I love the Danaher story. So was started by two brothers, the Rails brothers, very iconic, Mitch and Steve Rails. So they actually started very interestingly with industrial. So they bought this company. I forgot what it actually does, but I think it was like car parts or something. And it's kind of funny because like when they went out to buy it, like they had this idea of like basically how to LBO it, but they had no money to LBO it. So they were like, okay, they went
Yeah.
to like the owner of the business and they were like, okay, we'll give you like I thought the story, but it's like there's a really good podcast on it. It was like, we'll give you like 1 million and you will use your cash flows to underwrite like whatever part of the buyout, and then like we'll get like debt for the other part. And then the owner was like, cool, like how are you gonna get the million?
Yeah.
So then they went to a banker, and the banker was down to give them 1 million, but it was because their dad backstopped them. So that was kind of the actual story, according to Steve Rails. But that's how they got started. They acquired their first business, they operationally improved it, they ran it, and then they used the cash flows to buy a second. They started compounding in industrials, and they like Danaher as a business has had like three story arcs where it was like industrials. I think it was parts, and then it got into industrials, and then they made their 3.0 pivot was into life sciences, which is kind of the Danaher we know today and that we all love. And yeah, it was just like there it is. I think a lot of it why I really like Danaher was because like also why I am like kind of like a student of Buffett is like this idea of like compounding being this powerful force has always stuck with me of like if you do something just for like a long period of time where like you're basically operationally improving and you're kind of every day you're just like getting a little bit better like over like a long period of time you'll have like insane outcomes, which is also kind of feeds into why I kind of started disliking the venture system because there is this force that forces you to move really fast to do things kind of like and do things really fast and kind of try to like get these like insane jumps of basically growth in a compressed period of time. And like as a student of compounding, that was something that started like that was kind of like a, I don't know, identity dissociation almost, where it was like, okay, like
Yeah.
this is something I don't really want to be like more involved with and more of like how do I rebuild like compounding stories.
Yeah, as the venture apologist I am, I will say I think some of the best venture outcomes have been companies that kind of did nothing for a long time, like Figma, for example. They didn't have a real product for like the first 5 years of their existence, and investors were like, "What the hell is happening?" And then Dylan came out and put out these products, and so there was like a 5 year period of just building in silence, trying to iterate, trying to find your way to product market fit. Similarly, with a company like Polymarket that was started when no one was thinking about prediction markets, and they quietly built for a long time until their moment came and they started scaling. A bunch of other companies as well. But I agree with the sentiment that like if you're investing investing venture dollars into a fast growing startup, you are kind of just momentum trading at that point. And the real venture returns, I think, come from investing in startups no one's thinking about that show really slow progress for the first few years, but have this crazy exponential to them in like the following 5 years or whatever. So I kind of agree, kind of agree, kind of disagree. But I get what you mean. Um, Forgot where we left off. It was around Danaher and what they were building. So you started writing more about biotech theses. What was your first biotech thesis?
Was
It
the
was this,
Danaher
right?
thesis. It was the distressed biotech IP thesis.
Biotech IPT. Okay. If you were to execute on that thesis today, what would you buy?
What would I buy? This is a very hard question because I think I never came to that where
You're like, I don't have the money. I don't have to think about what to buy.
yeah, it's like my so like actually like executing on the thesis was like a very difficult thing for me to think about
Yeah.
because like I feel like the sweet spot would be like seed stage companies where like the purchase price is like very reasonable where like okay they just like kind of like made the wrong market bet and now they just have a portfolio of IP they developed with their first round and they just couldn't raise a Series A or maybe they did raise a Series A and they kind of like just in the market.
Companies like yours that cannot raise follow-on capital, but have like actual IP.
Yeah, like I spent a lot of time like because like to actually operate the thesis, like you basically needed a sourcing mechanism of like how do you source these deals, a operational mechanism of what are you going to do with this IP, and obviously capital to backstop all of that. Those are like the three big hurdles that
Yeah.
I kind of like came across when I was thinking about how to execute on it. Like from
Yeah.
a sourcing perspective, it was like okay, like
Well, that's
some funds
easier.
maybe. It's obvious that like I am trying to buy IP that sits in a very like a part of the market where it's like kind of like all over the place. So the thesis was that you would have to like go build these relationship with all these like venture funds who kind of know what the fuck in their portfolio is broken. This is kind of like the actual like there's this company called like Tiny, which is like that was kind of their
Oh yeah.
strategy.
Aren't
Yeah,
they being flamed right now?
yes, unfortunately, they are not. Yeah, they're being flamed, but yeah, the premise it's a very similar premise to like how they were thinking about it, where it's like, okay, you need to know the right VCs who know which portfolio companies are just
Yeah.
like in hot shit, and you can give these companies a path out of that by just being like, hey, I'll buy your IP. And
Why did Tiny? No, I don't know if they failed, but they've not like the returns haven't been what was promised. What do you think they went wrong? Because they're sort of executing on this thesis, right? But they're not. I guess they're not rolling up companies. They're just buying stakes in smaller cash flowing businesses.
yeah, I actually don't really know what's going on with Tiny, honestly. Like I don't really have a strong opinion on it. Like to my theory would be that they were trying to go big too fast. Like, and like how many of
Mm,
these like web apps are really that like cash flow creative, right? Like, because like Tiny is a copy of like Constellation software, right? Constellation software is the iconic example of like, yes, we can just roll up all the fucking software in the world and we can just run that as a playbook. And they were obviously trying to copy that playbook. Their mileage seems to have varied, but I think their story is not over yet, but maybe they do deserve some of the flame they're getting. I don't know.
Yeah, my left curve take is that anyone who tries to build the Berkshire Hathaway for X is it just immensely cursed. Like whether it's Chamath or if it's Tiny or whoever else, like you try to build the next Berkshire Hathaway, it's just not gonna happen. Like Berkshire Hathaway is what it is because it's been around for so many fucking years. The reputation is compounded over decades. You cannot wake up tomorrow and say, I'm gonna build the next Berkshire Hathaway. That is just not a selling point that you have. And anyone who is trying to do that just has way too much hubris. But that's a kind of a side note.
I mean, I agree with you though. Like, I mean, to add on that, like when Tiny went public, I think they went public through a SPAC, and that already kind of like raised like a eyebrow for me. I was like, huh, like, is
Oh,
this?
they
Yeah,
did. I
like
didn't know that.
I think
Wow.
yeah, it was a weird. They went public in a really weird way, which is why I didn't really spend that much time looking at it. Like, obviously, like
Mm.
I've heard of like Andrew Wilkinson, and like I do look up to like this other investor called like Jeremy Giffen. He has a
I
famous, he does like
love
the best
Kifon. Yeah, yeah,
podcast.
yeah. Yeah,
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 and they
yeah.
all came out of Tiny, right? So like I think like
Yeah.
they're not like stupid people, but like how that was brought public and given to maybe like retail is like obviously a different question. But yeah, I
Yeah.
do agree with your take. Like I'm a little complexity pilled myself, and I think like it is like you can't really just try to replicate something that already exists. You kind of have to like let that evolve over time.
Mm.
And yeah, it's just like, but if you're dumping it like that is a very specific story you want to dump on people because everyone knows like Berkshire,
Yeah.
then sure. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a
Yeah, that's valid. Um, so that was your first thesis. Your second thesis was around biosecurity, or was there something before that? I
it
forget
was
now.
on CROs actually. It was I started thinking a
CROs.
lot more about so this is when the genesis of this thesis was Charles River had a 30%
Wait,
drop
before
in their
you say
market cap.
CROs are contract research organizations that
Yes.
are pretty foundational in the biotech world, where biotech companies outsource their core R&D work to these companies, these CROs that have all of this infrastructure where they can kind of scale the research on a contract to contract basis, and biotech drug development companies or drug discovery companies don't have to front the big fixed cost of building all this R&D equipment themselves or buying all this R&D equipment themselves. That's kind of the gist of CROs, right?
Yes, yes. It's basically a fee for service kind of model where like buying lab equipment is very expensive and you
Yeah,
don't want to be putting your investor dollars into buying lab equipment because
yeah.
already kind of like getting a biotech company through the journey of a biotech company is already expensive as fuck. So you don't want to be buying lab equipment, which is also expensive as fuck. So it kind of evolved out of that where it's like, okay, then we'll just like build like these like organizations that kind of like create this quote unquote shared infrastructure where it's like, okay, well, you can outsource a lot of your core R&D workflows to like a company that is basically optimized to do that for you. So with like River, they were the first guys to do basically contract rat testing research, where like they were the founder, like I believe I don't think he invented, I forgot what I think he was just breeding mice. I forgot what he actually did, but like it was something and he just started offering these services where it's like, okay, we'll test whatever you want on the mice that I am breeding, and I'll give you the data. And he just got really good at doing that because it's a very specific part of the workflow where you just like, okay, we'll breed mice for you. And you can kind of scale that. There's like economies of scale. There's like kind of operational efficiencies you can kind of gain out of that. Similar to, I guess, like the Danaher kind of business system where it's like, okay, if you just do one thing and you get really good at doing that, you will be able to extract efficiencies out of that.
Mm,
And the biotech industry has kind of evolved over time to really just rely on that industry because it's like, okay, like it doesn't really, it's already so expensive for us to get through like clinical trials and do everything. Like we need to outsource as much as possible. And just as long as we own our core IP and we can get to market, we are good. That is kind of like the whole premise of the biotech industry.
yeah. So what was your CRO thesis?
Yeah, it was not like more of a thesis, but it was a thesis around the fact that like the industry has become overly, in my opinion, reliant on CROs, where it's like it feels kind of like broken in a way where it's like, okay, everyone is trying to just like inch like incremental efficiency out as much as possible because it's clear that everything is way too expensive. So and like, okay, like you can raise 10 million or 100 million, and you obviously want to be the guy that owns 10 million, raises 10 million, owns as much of your company as possible. And to do that, like kind of the industry has moved towards this direction where it's like we're trying to rely on as much contract work as possible. And in my mind, you also lost a lot of like this like serendipity coming out of that, where it's like, okay, like
Mm,
you're obviously you're not like I feel like a lot of these are cool drug discovery like kind of like things where just like, oh yeah, we found penicillin because in the trash because we threw it at our plate. And it's like,
yeah.
okay, and instead we're gonna outsource it to like Charles River and then they're gonna fucking figure things out for us. And it just feels kind of like the whole essence of like the scientific idea of scientific discovery seemed to be lost to me.
Yeah.
And I think it was almost like a greater critique of how the biotech industry works, where it's like there's like the people on the accepting end, which is big pharma, right? These are basically just marketing companies. Like that's all they do, where they own a portfolio of assets and they're just really good at marketing things. And that's their competitive advantage. And they just like, but because of they're good at that, they also have all these like this portfolio of assets that's really cash flow creative. They can just buy new assets. So they're just chilling back. They are really well known for not taking any risk now because like, okay, we can just buy risk assets from other
Well,
people.
they also interface with healthcare and insurance. That's like their big value add, right?
No, they don't. They sell the drugs. The insurers, I mean, like, I guess they do, but like that, there's almost like a different industry for that. They call it like PBMs. That's a very
Yes,
complex
yes,
industry, but they're
yes,
not really
yes.
involved. Like, I feel like the pharma
Well,
industry
what does
also does not
PBM
like
stand? What does PBM stand for again? It's pharma
pharmaceutical
business.
benefit manager or something.
Yes, pharmaceutical benefit manager. Yes.
Yes, very whack industry too. And I feel like I'm pretty sure pharma also doesn't like the PBM system, but they just can't do anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems really hard to kind of have the CRO capabilities in-house if you're trying to build a new drug. Like you can't upfront the cost of, getting your own, I don't know, Illumina sequencer or a PacBio sequencer or all of this crazy equipment we saw at the Ginkgo labs, for example. Like you simply, it's not possible, right?
Yeah, maybe I feel like the biggest component has always been labor and maybe not
Yeah.
necessarily equipment, where it's like a lot of these like kind of workflows have been standardized. So like they're like a lot of the kind of like actual like picks and shovels, like you can probably access it like anywhere. It's just the problem has been like the actual like labor cost component of it is kind of expensive and you only need it for like a incremental part of your kind of like your assets kind of life cycle where it's like, okay, like for example, you have an asset, you need to do like preclinical work. You want to see if it actually poisons like a rat. It's like, okay, like you do you want to hire someone to do that, which is like kind of like a 3 month kind of thing, or do you just outsource it to Charles River and they'll just feed it to their rats? And I think the kind of industry has defaulted to that, where it's like, okay, we can just contract it out. We don't have to take on the issue of hiring someone, take on this labor cost, taking
Yeah.
this like there's obviously complications with just
Yeah.
having like people in your lab. And I think that's kind of the default mind because like it does give you incremental cost savings. But then that has also been like the reason why like this is also why I'm really interested in like overseas biotech, like Indian biotech or like Chinese biotech, because like they've been able to just slash labor costs because their people are just so cheap. So like a lot
Yeah.
of people, there's like really interesting company called like PopVax. He's like this
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Indian
I
guy.
know
Yes,
that.
you know
Yes.
him?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes,
I
I
find the
know him.
story kind of fascinating. I mean, I don't know that much about the company, but like the story is interesting of like, okay, we'll just raise American capital, but we'll go to India and we'll just build our team in India and we'll just own everything in-house and you can do
Yeah.
everything in-house. It's pretty interesting of
So,
like kind of going around that labor cost.
so they're like a CRO, basically just a CRO.
They are not a zero. They are making vaccines. It's just that they hired all their talent in-house,
Oh, they hide their talent. Right. Makes sense. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just so
Yeah.
much cheaper. But like the
Yeah.
thing is like the problem with going with the CRO is that you are kind of like basically a victim of the CRO's own schedule. So you can't move fast. Like the whole idea of like move fast and break things does not apply with a CRO because it's like, no, you are scheduled in and you will get the data whenever I give you the data because I'm running it on my schedule. And it's
Mm.
like from like a, just like a pure kind of like startup mind philosophy, it's like, okay, like your destiny's kind of out of your hand because you're just relying on this other guy to do all the shit for you. And
Yeah.
what like if something like in the middle of say like running your experiment where like okay we're gonna test like XYZ and XYZ in like ABC way like you can they will not pivot it for you like they're not thinking about you they're thinking about no we're gonna run your fucking experiment and we're gonna give you the data and if the data's fucked well cool you can pay me more to just like run it again. They're not going to be like midway of the experiment be like oh wait this is a really shitty way of running this experiment let's do it the other way. Like they're not going to do that so like that's why I was developing that like thought process around the fact that like this whole CRO system is broken. And I think it speaks to the more greater brokenness of biotech as like an industry where you won't like if a biotech company gets funded tomorrow, you're not going to be like, wow, that is going to be the next Pfizer. You're just going to be like, no, that is the next victim of Pfizer because they're going to build an asset. If they're successful, their outcome is Pfizer will buy them. It is not like no, like every day, which is why like the tech industry is so much more like interesting from like a comparable perspective. Like every like new company that started, like you're like, okay, like there might be hope that this will be the next category defining company. But with
Yeah.
like biotech, that is not true, where you will not look at a company like, yes, you are the next Pfizer. Which is why like I'm also a big fan of like stories like Vertex Pharmaceuticals, where it's like, okay, they were able to kind of like keep their own assets in-house. They were able to financing in a really good way where like they might have potential to become like a big pharma player. Like right now they're like medium pharma, which is like, okay, it's kind of like they're able to break out of that kind of like, I don't know, what do you call like, what is that word when you're like you're in like this kind of like abusive relationship and it's like circular, like that word.
Like a spiral, downward spiral type of thing. Well, actually, before I ask, before we get to that, why is Pfizer so powerful? Is it just the fact that they have all of these drugs, all this cash flow from these drugs that makes them a massive behemoth that they can just snap up any new drug that comes to market, or what is it exactly that makes them so big and powerful?
Well, the thing is that they have so much money, and the problem with biotech as an industry is that there's not enough money to go around. So it's like, okay, like you get to the end of the line, you kind of like you, for example, you clear phase 3 for somehow you've raised enough money to clear phase 3, and now you're
Yeah,
ready to go to market. So you would need to raise a shit ton of money to basically build that sales infrastructure to go to market, right? And
got
that
it.
costs money. And like the problem I think with biotech that I kind of came to notice, or like basically these more like capital intensive industries, is that there isn't really a good financing mechanism because you're not generating like a sustained amount of revenue. So like the underwriting process is a little difficult where it's like, okay, you don't have a clear revenue stream to like kind of underwrite. So like part of the whole like CRO thesis actually it was a comment it was commentary on like kind of like why the industry is like dependent on CROs and like what would you have to do to really like take like to kind of fix that. And like the conclusion I actually came to was the fact that we needed to create new financing vehicles for the industry because it was clear that this idea of that you have to clear phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and those are your financing kind of like milestones is just not that healthy. Like it's like, and the fact that this is dilutive capital, it just didn't really make sense. And that's why I got.
Wasn't that kind of the point of these search funds and them speculating on like, I don't know, preclinical readouts or phase 1 readouts and just wasn't that kind of what they were doing?
What do you mean by search funds?
Or SPAC vehicles that were shell vehicles that would promise to acquire the right drug, and the market would kind of price the probability of them finding the right drug, and they would go and acquire a company, that's in like phase 1 or phase 2. Or am I completely getting that wrong?
No, I don't think you're getting that right because it's like it's more like I mean, like these SPAC vehicles are just like a mechanism of bringing these assets to the public, which is like a
Yeah,
more, this is also commentary of the fact that there's just not that much money in the private markets for biotech. So to get the money
yeah.
they need, they have to go public. And then that creates its own issue where like public markets do not understand biotech assets because they do not generate cash flows. They are very complex technologies. They're very hard to underwrite. And when they're taking to like the public markets, like you will see them get punished for like some random ungodly reasons. My thesis on how to fix that was that we needed to just give these companies new financing mechanisms that are like not dependent on equity or debt. Could you underwrite like, or actually it is kind of like a debt vehicle where it's like, okay, can you underwrite debt through their IP? That's kind of what like, or like, can you give them take something from the company and give them financing? But it's kind of just like smooths out that financing curve for them, which is why I got really interested in like pharma royalties, for example, because of like this idea like, okay, you take a royalty on like a phase 2 asset, it's like, and you give them a bit of financing to kind of smooth out that curve where they don't have to raise equity, but you own a piece of like the IP. Like it's like where you can kind of start like basically financializing more parts of the company that is not just their equity. That was kind of the actual premise of that thesis because it was clear that these companies cannot, like this whole industry is really broken and they cannot just rely on the fact that they have to raise equity.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I remember talking to our unnamed founder, the CRO, the next gen CRO that we visited in Boston, who was trying to build a better CRO that was faster, cheaper, more iterative. And he highlighted all of the problems that you just talked about, where like the traditional CROs just are very slow and cumbersome, and you kind of lose the serendipity of experimentation. Cool. It sounds like there's answers unclear about what you actually do here. Your next thesis was around biosecurity, right?
I believe so. Yes, yes. So it was biosecurity, I think.
Why did you start thinking about biosecurity?
Oh yeah, this is interesting. I mean, I was part of the syn biocycle, so I was always interested in the fact that you could engineer biology, and that was
Yeah,
what got me really like excited about the prospect of biotech in the first place.
yeah.
So the story of how I got interested in biosecurity is a weird story where like I was running a book club and I invited this author, his name is Andrew Hessel, to talk about his book, which is on syn bio. I was actually not thinking about biosecurity at the time. I was like, cool, cool, this is cool technology. But like when we were talking to him, like a big thing he was concerned about was biosecurity. This idea that you can engineer whatever the fuck you want, and there is like this dual use kind of issue with that. And as this technology of advances with your ability to engineer biology kind of advances, like you have to advance the defensive capabilities of that. So that was really interesting. I was like, okay,
Well,
the same.
before we get to like the defensive capabilities part, I don't think it's very intuitive for most people to grok the idea of what it means to engineer biology. It took me a while to kind of wrap my head around that. And the analogy that, I mean, makes most sense to me is that we manipulate zeros and ones in computer code. We can similarly manipulate DNA base pairs, A, T, C's, and G's in DNA to engineer all sorts of new mechanisms of life that can do things that you want them to do in a predetermined manner because you know exactly the genetic code a certain virus needs to survive and thrive. And that presents all sorts of dangers and all sorts of opportunities as well. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, it's like it's. I think the parallel really is similar to the computing industry, where it's like, okay, like you. I think it's. I would like add more to that analogy where like there is this pre-existing install base of biological code, which is humans, right? Like we are running on
Yeah.
CGTs. So like I think that's a difference. But so like, but the thing is that our ability to manipulate these ACGTs are much more easier now, and which means we can also, but biology has already evolved like weapons against humans. Like that's how we fucking die, I guess. Things like bacteria, things like pathogens, these things like are also like run on biological code and you can do whatever you want with them. And there is this existing install base of already kind of like if you call them like human code, then it's like, okay, like there is like this obvious threat where if you kind of like bring the analogy back to like computing, where it's like, okay, as the install base of computers grew and as our dependence on computers grew, there was this kind of like issue with cybersecurity where it's like, okay, we're storing a lot of like data. This is running a lot of things in the world, and there is this threat of defending against basically actors that are not in your best interest of like trying to take advantage of the fact that they could shut you down and shut and actually affect something that's happening in, I guess, the real world. But the same thing can kind of apply where it's like, okay, there's this install base of biological code, and there might maybe people that like are malicious actors who want to kind of disrupt that to, I don't know, like affect something. And there are ways for them to do that in the form of like I guess like viruses or like bacteria or whatever you call it, right? So that was that was the kind of like the premise of like why biosecurity is like a really interesting underrated like asset class.
Yeah. Um, the analogy really makes sense to me, except when it comes to computers, they were like this fundamentally consumer-facing piece of technology where you could learn to program a computer and do it pretty easily from sitting at home. You can't really do that with biology. You have to be a trained lab scientist to go out and manipulate these ATCs and Gs. So are we seeing this kind of exponential increase in people building new biological data sets that we ought to protect against, or is it still like super nascent, and is biosecurity just like this overblown thing that, do we really, how pertinent is it to this moment in time?
I would actually disagree with your first premise actually, where like it's very like I guess consumer facing. I would say like most like consumers actually don't understand how like the underlying like computing like I guess like infrastructure works. Like if you're thinking about like actually like North Korean hackers like hacking into like banks and stuff, like an average homie could not do that. Like it takes like
That's
very
true. That's
sophisticated
true. But I
understanding of
guess,
how information flows.
but the average homie can print hello world on some Python IDE. But like that's pretty simple to do, and you start there and you learn more about how you generate code for all sorts of different programs. You can't really do that with biology.
I mean, actually, like you still have to take like an intro like Python course. Like for that, the reason why that is easy is because IDEs are really accessible now, and the same analogy can be applied with like biology, where like you can take an intro biology course pretty easy and kind of understand the basic premise of how biological code works. And the question is like how easy and accessible are one, the tools and the basically understanding of how to actually do this engineering. And I'd say like LLMs make like the second part really easy, where it's like it's really pretty easy to understand how you manipulate this biological code with help of someone an LLM that's trained on all this like kind of like the body of research. And then the first part of like the accessibility of these tools is like it's pretty accessible. Like it's not that hard to get access to these tools.
Yeah, I guess the biological IDE in my mind is still a wet lab where you have to pipette things in and out of test tubes and move like molecules around. But I guess the argument you would make is that we're increasingly seeing the proliferation of, virtual cell models and all sorts of things that can model complex biological systems in silico, as in on computer. And that makes things a lot easier, cheaper, faster.
Yeah, and I would also say like if you're thinking about like how like just cybersecurity works, it's usually like pretty well-funded groups who have a really deep understanding of how like computational infrastructure works to be able to take advantage of that. Like so it's like my hallmark example, I guess, is like the Lazarus group, which is like this North Korean like funded
Very
hackers who just
familiar,
steals
very
like
familiar,
yes,
yes.
very cool stories actually. Like if you kind of like extend that to biology, like what would a biological Lazarus group look like? And like they could do kind of the same stuff, except they need to set up their own wet lab, right? And setting up a wet
Mm,
lab is not that hard. Like it's like you
so?
can set up a you can set up a wet lab in your own garage. It's not that hard to like really replicate a lot of the things. Like I have a friend who like set up like a wet lab in his garage, yeah, and it cost him like K to get like the basic infrastructure set up. Like it's not that deep to get access to all like the tooling to do so. You just need to have a deep understanding of how biological systems work, which can be as you can have assistance with a LLM. And the LLM can also help you design really novel kind of mechanisms, new proteins that may be kind of like a new
Mm.
enzyme that can help like a virus like infect you. Like they're like the threat is definitely there, I'd say.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I remember in talking to like the compound folks, one of the things that they talked about in their theses was regulating the DNA printers like Twist Bio and or creating like a consortium of them where they kind of have like a unified set of standards around what DNA synthesis they actually do and what they ship out versus them just doing it on an ad hoc basis. I guess that's one way to mitigate the risks of like people working with or ordering random pieces of DNA that you think could be harmful.
Yeah, but then like there's the American twist bio, but then what if there's
Yeah,
like a foreign version? Like they probably don't
yeah.
care.
Yeah.
And
I'm very bearish on the idea of actually creating like a unified standard of things where, there's like complete control of one body over all of this. Like the free market will do its thing. People will get the stuff they want. And in that case, something like you're talking about, where you have a much more proactive cybersecurity style preventative, or what do you call it? Yeah, just preventative measures in place to identify biosecurity threats, mitigate them, and do all of these things. That's more relevant.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, like my direct analogy was like CrowdStrike. Like when I was writing this thesis, I spent a lot of time thinking about the history of CrowdStrike, and it's like essentially it was the very
What is
much the same
CrowdStrike?
premise. I mean, CrowdStrike is, well, now they're publicly traded, but they're like a cybersecurity company and they interface on the like actual like infrastructure layer of a lot of this like computing infrastructure. And their whole premise is to try to detect threats and just squash them before they become an issue. Or they're like, there's also, this has been a while since I looked at this thesis, but it was like a big part of how they got started was that they would become like the solvers where like you have a biological issue, or no, you have a computing issue, a hacker issue. Like you call CrowdStrike and they come in and they will deal with your thing. So they're basically this like monitoring layer that sits on top of like essentially any business that takes on like a basically a cybersecurity risk, which is basically every company on existence, which is
Is
why like
this
it reflected in their stock price.
is similar to Palo Alto Networks?
Yeah, they are actually direct competitors. Yeah. I also looked at Palo Alto Networks actually. Yeah, they are both cited in my thesis. It's just CrowdStrike is more cool. So I spent more time like thinking about them. Palo Alto Networks makes advanced firewalls. So actually, yeah, like I took like kind of like two inspirations from this. Like Palo Alto Networks are basically they're building like advanced firewalls. And that was like my thinking about like this idea of like how do you do like this, what is the biological firewall equivalent for, I guess, like biosecurity? So that was like the first premise. And then second would be like CrowdStrike, which sits more on this monitoring layer of like, okay, we'll be proactive. We'll like kind of try to look for threats, and then we'll kind of like have this like basically like collective intelligence per se. And like that was the monitoring layer. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Like those are like the two analogies. The biological one for like monitoring was pretty obvious of like, okay, we'll just try to create a radar and we'll kind of like try to like detect pieces of DNA that are like foreign, and we'll
Yeah.
try to see if there's like the collective intelligence that can monitor that and like constantly learn, which is kind of what CrowdStrike does. But then what would the advanced like kind of like firewall look like? I don't know. For me, it was like, okay, maybe like better like filters for like a lot of these like labs or like kind of places that kind of transmit biological risk. I didn't really spend that much time thinking about that because like, I feel like the
Yeah.
analogy was not holding that well there, but like
Yeah, it
it's
seems
kind of
really
worth thinking
hard.
about. Yeah. It makes more
It,
sense because like there's
yeah.
like there are like these like pipelines that exist within computing infrastructure where like it makes obvious sense where you can like put a firewall. It's like, okay, yeah, like I need
Yeah.
to access XYZ, drop firewall there.
And these are public goods. These are not company owned protocols. You have HTTP, you have TCP/IP, like these are just public goods that are the pipes of the internet. No one person controls them. So yeah, it's very different.
Yeah. I do think like over relying on analogies is a bad thing, but like I think
Yeah.
it does hold to a certain
It
extent of like
it gives you inspiration. I think it's good.
yeah, yeah. And then yeah, the inspiration was like thinking about how you would rebuild the biological equivalent of CrowdStrike, which was the thesis. And that was what kind of got me super interested in looking at like Ginkgo biosecurity because that was seemed kind of similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Why don't you tell us a bit more about Ginkgo Biosecurity and I guess some of the public information we learned when we were at the Ginkgo HQ a few weeks ago in Boston?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go over like why it really aligns with the CrowdStrike thesis is because they
Yeah.
are essentially trying to rebuild like the monitoring layer, and they call it the bioradar, which is basically we're going to try to detect like foreign pathogens or whatever before it even becomes an issue. And we will install these into like these like basically hotspots where it's like, okay, like an airport is where like you'll most likely have the pathogen be introduced, and we'll detect that and we'll feed it into a collective intelligence. So that was kind of like that's why it aligns really well with that thesis where like they're trying to install and partner with like governments to install like these radars in these like hotspots or these nodes. But I guess that's what they call them, nodes. And then we're
Yeah.
going to detect that and we'll feed it into our database and make sure that we're constantly monitoring that. And I think that's like a really powerful concept. I do think there is more thought that can be put onto like what are other nodes that are not just like these airports, like because like the power of like say CrowdStrike is that over time there was just a larger and larger dependency on like computing, and so every company ended up having cybersecurity risk. So if you wanted to operate a functional business, you needed to basically have to get a contract with CrowdStrike or their competitor, blah blah blah, blah, right? So there was like this growth in like cybersecurity risk. And I do think there is like this equivalent like growth in like biosecurity risk. And I think how do you interface that? It depends on what these nodes are.
What is the equivalent growth in biosecurity risk look like? Like, do we have, I guess that was the question earlier. Like, do we have random developers churning out random pathogens?
I mean that's an unanswerable question, but like I think just like if you think about just like natural pathogens and becoming more and more like reoccurring, like I think that is
Right.
something that's just true. Like I mean the bird flu was the big thing that caused the egg shortage, and like in theory, if
That's a
you could
good point. Yeah.
interface in a proper node properly, like you could have detected that really early and could have like mounted a response versus like letting bird flu happen. So I do think like there are like do think it's really early innings still because like the adoption of like say like biological technology is not like
Yeah.
everyone's just doing shit with biology today. I don't think that's true, but I do think
Yeah.
there's just a lot of like natural risks that are being like that are like that do exist that could be like defended against. Like I think agriculture is
Yeah.
like the hallmark example for in my mind. Hospitals
I,
maybe
I, I,
like
I I think the way you tell people about it is like, dude, if biosecurity matters because right now you're paying $12 for a carton of eggs and it should be $5. And the reason why you're paying double is because we let the bird flu go wild and we could have actually prevented it from happening. I think that's how you sell it to the average person because I think it's very like yes, we went through a pandemic, but people have kind of just forgotten about it or they don't want to relive that trauma. They don't want to think about it too hard. But like the more pertinent thing today is just the price of eggs.
yeah. I mean, I think it's just defending against like tail risks like that, right? Like the pandemic was a tail risk, the whole
Yeah.
egg shortage was a tail risk. And there are a lot of these tail risks that seem to be like reoccurring more frequently. And I think there's like a multitude of factors that lead to that. But like
Like
the
what?
sell for, I mean, I think climate change is always the big kind of like thing of that because like climate change equals temperatures that are more prone for bacterial or pathogenic evolution.
Mm.
And there's also this like these pathogens are transmitting easier to like from like animal vectors to humans, and that is causing well, it's yeah, like they're just evolving really well, and then they're easily transmitted to animals, which is like the core issue, and sometimes they will jump to humans, which is kind of what happened with like, the pandemic. But even just like the evolution happening and kind of going into like animals has already become like a big issue. And like defending of that against that already seems kind of pretty like you should probably do that.
Yeah, we should probably do that. When talking about these Ginkgo Bioworks biosecurity nodes, these nodes are literally just rooms with Illumina or PacBio sequencers, right? I think this is a good segue into talking about what sequencing is and why it matters for biosecurity specifically. So my understanding is that Ginkgo takes these samples from determine nodes around the country in places like airports, other places, and sequences samples of data. What does sequencing really look like? What does DNA sequencing tell us?
Yeah, I think yeah, the segue, yeah, like the by nature, like getting interested in biosecurity got me interested in sequencing as like the core foundational technology to detect like pathogens. And what sequencing does is it reads the DNA of whatever sample you're feeding through it. So with in the case of Ginkgo Biosecurity, they have an install base of like these Illumina sequencers where they will collect samples through their various mechanisms and they will try to detect what DNA is in that sample and then kind of pattern match that to a database of pre kind of sequence samples where it's like, okay, this is the DNA of a virus. This is the DNA of XYZ bacteria, and you can kind of pattern match that to detect if there might be a interesting like kind of like issue. And if there's like novelty in the viral sequence DNA, then you can kind of flag that and be like, oh, there might be an issue within that sample. So that's kind of like what naturally kind of like I was like, okay, you definitely need like sequencing as part of this monitoring infrastructure. And how
Yeah.
would you do that?
Sorry to pause you there, but is the right way to think about it is that the sequencing gives you a sense of the ATCs and Gs in whichever order they're in. And so they run an ML algorithm on top of it and compare it to an existing database of viral pathogens, non-problematic pathogens, non-problematic bacteria, and go, okay, this ADC and G sequence matches this, so it must be that. That's fine. But this sequence does not match anything we have. So let's flag that and look deeper. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, exactly. Where it's like
Okay.
it's monitoring. Yeah, it's you're basically trying to detect like foreign or novel DNA. And I have been trying to do more like research into what other technologies on top of sequencing there are for this monitoring layer. I mean, Raman spectroscopy might be one of those. I still need
Yeah.
to think more and do more research on that. But yeah, that's just like yeah. But core like sequencing is a core to this detection workflow because it detects the actual I call it like the hardware, I guess, that is kind of coming in, and you have to really see if is that a clean piece of hardware or is that like a potential issue, and that's kind of how you kind of like mount a response.
Yeah. Um, you were saying something earlier about where the sequencing is going and what you're looking at within the sequencing landscape.
Yeah, I mean, what happened as I kind of got really interested in sequencing is that it was clear that this idea of like owning like biological data seems to be this core input to understanding biology and being able to actually like do things with it. And it was clear that like sequencing as like a technology was being neglected relative to the applications of sequencing, which have been like kind of really hot. Like this idea that you can basically draw some of your blood and send it to Grail and they'll see if you have cancer has become like a really like attractive premise because it's like, okay, cool, like I can do early cancer detection and that's a really valuable application. And
Yeah.
a lot of people have been tightly, I guess, like connected with the computational analogy of like, yeah, like making the chips is not as valuable as being the dude that makes the piece of software, which may have some validity, but you also are fading the importance of the underlying chip. Which like if you kind of like I think like not all analogies are not perfect, but like if you look at what's happening currently in the semiconductor industry, where like okay, like we basically faded the importance of chips, and now we've outsourced all of that into this little country called Taiwan, and it's creating this like massive dependency. I thought like this kind of like the current like market sentiment around like tooling and the value of these tools being like they're fading the value relative to the applications. It felt kind of wrong. And it's clear that like countries like, I guess the hallmark example within our town square of biotech is this idea that Chinese biotech is overtaking us and everyone is concerned about that. But it's also been very clear that China basically strategically created their own Illumina clone. They invested in that, they created it, and now this clone is selling sequencers all over the world. And they are actually selling sequencers to this company that's about to IPO called, but
Chinese
yeah,
Illumina.
you might have to cut this out actually. This is like kind of like insider information, but yes, I was told this recently where they use BGI sequencers, and I was like, oh, interesting. But it's like it's clear
Huh.
like that like the Chinese government has made sequencing a national priority. They're like, oh, cool, we're gonna create our own version of the sequencing companies, and we're gonna make it our because they don't want to lose the like the biology race that the same way they lost like the computing race, where it's like, okay, like we're like basically what's happening in like semiconductor industry is like, oh fuck, like we're a little behind. Cool, we can't get the advanced technology because everyone's being a dipshit. And it's like, okay, we're behind. So we're not gonna let that happen to us with the biotech industry. We're gonna make sure we fucking get ahead of that. And so they've invested into creating these clones. They have a clone of Oxford Nanopore, they have a clone of Illumina, and they made a priority to collect this like biological data. So BGI was selling this like cancer diagnostic test that maybe not cancer diagnostic, but it was for like it was a prenatal test, and they
Yeah.
were collecting all the data, and it was this massive scandal where they're like, okay, they didn't tell the people that they were going to collect their data and they're going to train models on top of it. But it was clear that like China has made this a national priority, and it's clear that the market currently is fading the importance of sequencing like domestically within North America, and that was kind of me built. The sequencing war thesis was building the kind of a thesis around that kind of like idea where it's like one country has been kind of like making this a national priority, while the other country has kind of handed it off to the market mechanism, and the
But
market has faded the importance of this thing.
let's try to better understand why it is a national priority for China. Because with AI, it's so obvious. You are trying to make a digital god, and whoever makes a digital god first wins in any kinetic warfare scenario or the future of their industries. Everything is dependent on building this digital god. You have to plow as much money as we can into building a digital god, and for that, you need chips and semiconductors and NVIDIA and TSMC. What is the equivalent with sequencing here? Why is it such a national strategic priority?
I almost think it's like it's so hard to know what kind of having a better kind of like control over a complex system of like biology would actually really bring. Like it's kind of like, oh, like our ability to program computers, like we actually had no idea what that would actually lead to. And I think that's kind of the premise of like this kind of like interest within like kind of building all these virtual cell models or kind of like investing all this in time to kind of collect all this biological data is because like people kind of like have this inkling that there is something within like biology that's like really important, and being able to kind of turn that into a technology seems like this paradigm shift. And like there are people that kind of have like inklings of this is pretty important. Like Claude has their like life science model. I forgot
Yeah,
they launched this recently. Have not
yeah,
looked
yeah,
into
yeah.
it, but like it's clear
Same.
like these people like a lot of people do see it as like this kind of pillar of a growth opportunity. It's really hard to predict what that actually looks like from like an outcome perspective. because it's like, okay, like maybe like I think like like right now like when we look at just like liquid biopsy, like I think that's just like an early example of like what it could potentially bring of just like early cancer detection has already grown to become this like massive industry. But like what could this kind of like really deep understanding of a biological system really bring? I think that is TBD. But the Chinese government has clearly seen the technology and is like, this will be important in the future. Maybe it's like because we want our population to live longer, healthier lives, so they're more like economically productive. Who knows? Or like it could be a multitude of reasons, but it's clear that they've deemed a lot of these more like I call it like deep tech. Like I think they have a deep interest in deep tech, I would say. Like it's like EVs were deemed a national priority and they did a really good job with like onshoring a lot of that like
It,
capacity.
yeah. I just think that it's hard for people to wrap their heads around the non-deterministic nature of biology, where you input X, the output is not Y, it's something else entirely that you can't anticipate. But when it works out, it has insane results like mRNA vaccines or I don't know, GLP-1 drugs, things that you can't produce through like a deterministic process of X, A, B, C, and D. With like EVs, like you could very clearly see a world where EVs materially improve the lives of so many people in very
Mhm.
specific ways. In biotech and biology, it's still very much like we might discover a drug that may cure some aspect of Alzheimer's. Like that is the that is kind of the promise that people are hearing. Um, so maybe that's why it's hard for people and also governments to kind of get behind a lot of this. And China's doing a great job. Clearly, the US markets are fading sequencers for that very reason. Like we don't know where this is going. Is that the right way to think about this, or am I
I
getting
would
it
say
wrong?
so. Like, I mean, it's hard to understand the impact, but like you could make a really similar using the EV analogy. Like, okay, it's very clear this is a new mode of transport that's more efficient. Like, you think about
Yeah,
it, like if you develop like novel drugs that are like that really like human like improve human health or like maybe like increase your productivity in some capacity. Like, I don't know. I
yeah,
think diabetes drugs is like the GLP-1 whole thing about GLP-1s is like a good example of that. Of, like this is a actually a burden to society, like health burden. Introducing this to the market is actually like a net positive for society. And what if you monopolize that net positive for yourself? I think that is like an interesting premise that I think is how the Chinese government is thinking. This is all speculation, but like that's how I would think
yeah,
of it if I was a decision maker, where it's like, why should biotechnology be a national priority? There's like three prongs to it. There's one where it's like, okay, we can engineer biology to do things for us. That is a really
yeah,
cool premise. Hasn't really been proven out yet, but
yeah,
like it's like, okay, there are some like examples of it kind of working where it's like, okay, we've kind of been able to engineer these like microbes to create like fuels. It kind of like went okay, TBD. And then it's like, okay, we've engineered like China has this massive domestic like enzyme industry where like they've like they manufacture all these enzymes and these go into all these industrial products. So like there's kind of that aspect to it where it's like, okay, we can own like these like outputs, like these are tangible outputs to the industry. But I think when you think about human health, there are also tangible like outputs to human health where like GLP-1s, I think, is a really good example of that, where it's like, okay, like this is clearly a benefit to human health. And if this is a massive burden to our like healthcare system and we spend too much money there, like this will become an issue. And I think just like owning a lot of this technology like is kind of like very like interesting to them because like, okay, we actually kind
yeah.
of have an
K-
advantage in all these things.
Yeah, can you talk a bit more about where sequencing might fit into that process of novel drug development?
Yeah, I think sequencing is more of like this infrastructure layer, but it's our ability to collect like like it's a source of biological data, which I think is but it's like it's the common almost like the ground. Like I think it's collecting the hardware data because I think biology is interesting where like there's multiple layers of complexity where like your hardware layer, like if using the computing analogy, for example, like DNA is the hardware layer, but like the software layer is like so undiscovered where it's like okay, the DNA creates these mRNAs that have this other system around it that affects how they move around the body. And then this mRNA turns into proteins, which also have all these modifications that have been done to it. So there's like this multiple layers of complexity that kind of turn into an outcome. DNA is that ground like hardware layer that is there's a race to kind of collect as much information of that as possible. And I think that's kind of where like sequencing fits into it of like, okay, if we can have even an inkling of understanding of how the hardware layer works, we can probably develop drugs in a more like smart way that isn't just like doing random shit. And if we can do that, then we have novel drug candidates and we can break out of this like a vicious cycle of like drug kind of development costs kind of like increasing exponentially. So that's kind of like the premise around why sequencing matters. But I think that's just a very like healthcare oriented focus, like drug development focus, because like I think this idea of like collecting hardware data can interface in so many other things. Because like, okay, you've collected all this like what if you collect all this data around like novel enzyme sequences and you can use that to create a better enzyme? Like that is a completely like out of left field type of like thing that is kind of like out of scope. But like I think they're just like that's why it's like it's almost like so hard to speculate of
Yeah.
why this technology matters. But it's like it's almost like okay, it's kind of like obvious it'll do something, so like we kind of have to invest in it. But that's kind of like my take on it.
I think that's right. I think that's right. It's like it's obvious it will do something, so we have to put money behind it. Yeah, that makes sense. Because I think a guiding thesis that we've all been circling is just that you start sequencing more data, you create more genomic data sets out there. It leads to all sorts of interesting novel discoveries around, enzymes or whatever else. I think you're right. What was the name of that one company that was going out and collecting data sets from nature, like sequencing, I don't know, plants in the Arctic or something? What was the name?
Oh,
The
Basecamp.
Camp research. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That seems interesting, right? Like that is kind of like a novel proprietary data that they own.
Yeah, that's also what the
And
Chinese government is doing. The Chinese government has this imperative where they're going to sequence everything. That's also why they decided to put money behind BGI. Like their whole idea was like we're going to buy like the premise of BGI was that we're going to buy all these Illumina sequencers and we're just going to sequence every fucking thing and we're going to collect that data and we're going to do something with that data.
wait, I thought BJ was the Illumina competitor.
No, BGI is oh no. No, yeah, so the thing is they started buying the sequencers to do the sequencing, but then they decided to just make their own sequencers because they can do whatever the fuck they
Mm.
want. That was the story of that company. It's actually a really interesting story of like where they started because they started with like, okay, Chinese government wants to sequence things. Therefore, we will go buy the best sequencers. Well, I think they bought like 10 of them at the start or some shit. Like they were the biggest customer of Illumina at a certain point, I think,
Oh
because like they were
wow.
just like they were just installing so much sequencing capacity to do their thing. And then they started kind of like, okay, we're just gonna build our own sequencers because we don't want to take that geopolitical risk. I actually don't know the exact details. Would be really cool to learn more about that. But that was kind of like the premise. And now like they have this massive install base of sequencers and they copied their IP and now they're making their own sequencers. And yeah, that's the name of the
That
game.
sounds like a classic China story of like you start, buying tech and then you get a top-down directive of like, actually, no, you gotta copy this shit immediately and don't be reliant on on American companies. And now they have big market share, it seems like. Can we talk a bit about short read and long read sequencing, what the difference is and why it matters?
Yeah, this is like kind of foundational to how so DNA is a long chain. It's like a rope. Like it's a rope that is made up of AGC. It's like these molecules that we call AGCT. So it's like it's just a long rope and then it kind of forms a cool helix. But how short read sequencing kind of works as like how the technology works is that you basically cut up that rope and you break into really small fragments and then you just read the small fragments all at once in parallel. That's how you get it super cheap. You just amortize the cost of this massive rope over this kind of like massive sample. And you can do it really quickly. And then how short read works is that you basically have to computationally put that rope back together because you don't know how the fuck that rope looks like. So you kind of like basically break up that chain and then you try to reconstruct it. And the limitation is that you kind of have to predict how these little chains connect. So you cannot predict with 100% certainty that this fragment that you have is connected to this fragment. So there will always be a little bit of error in your ability to actually read the complete genome, but it got us pretty far. The reason why long read is an important technology is because you kind of actually read the whole rope at once. Like you basically have these longer fragments, so you have less kind of like predicting of like, okay, this fucking short piece connects to this piece, connects to this piece. So it's less kind of guesswork. So you have a better depth of actually reading what the actual code is, what does that rope actually say? Which is why like the issue is that to do that is a lot more expensive, and it's always been a lot more expensive because the way Illumina works is that you can amortize a sample over like this massive surface area, and so it can happen really quickly. But the problem with like a lot of these like, long read technologies is that either they're really error prone, which is kind of the issue that Oxford Nanopore has always had, where it's like, yes, they run their little rope through a pore and then they read the electrical signal. They turn the electrical signal into code, and then that. But the issue is that sometimes, the electrical signal is kind of fuzzy, so you don't know if it's like an A or a G. So they have this like a lot of this error. And then there's other technology, PacBio, which is similar-ish, not really. They kind of turn the rope into this circle, and then they basically spin it around like a camera, and then they can read it in like a circle, and they can get this really long read piece of DNA. Like long read fundamentally is better than short read just because of how the technology works. And unless like you can never get like I don't think you can ever get a perfect read with like short read sequencing. It
Oh,
is
a perfect read means that you know exactly how the ATCs and Gs line up in a DNA
yeah.
strand,
Yeah, there
right?
will always be like some parts you kind of have to guess or like put together,
Right,
right? So like
right,
there's
right,
always
right.
going to be some issue. And there's always like this massive computational component to reconstruct it, right? Like you
Yeah.
will always have to use a computer algorithm to reconstruct basically your sequence. With long read
It
technology, it kind of bypasses that because you kind of get the native sequence at once.
right, and that sounds pretty relevant to biosecurity, where like if you're trying to guess some of these errors, you're missing maybe a novel pathogen entirely if you guess wrong and you're not detecting it well. Is that the
Yeah,
right way to
but
think about it, maybe?
like fundamentally, yeah, like if you're trying to detect novelty, like if you miss something because your thing is guessing, like it obviously seems like from a fundamental technology perspective, like long read sequencing is the way to go for like a biosecurity application, especially if you're trying to detect something novel. Obviously, the issue is that it's just so much more expensive than like an Illumina sequencer. So
Hmm.
with like Illumina, like the benefit of using them is obviously like they're so cheap. And if you're like creating a bioradar where you're just trying to sequence everything, like okay, you're gonna go with the cheapest option because that is actually kind of expensive to sequence everything. But like we are seeing like more long read adoption with like more like relevant applications. Like for example, like rare disease testing, where you like how rare disease work is usually you have like a one or two like mutations in your DNA that causes you to have like some sort of like phenotype typic difference. So Down syndrome is like the hallmark example of like you have some sort of like mutation on your X chromosome that kind of causes it to not function well, and then you have Down syndrome. And like PacBio is obviously, I mean, things like long read sequencing are obviously the solution for this because you cannot be guessing of where that mutation is on which gene. You kind of need like a really good depth of like a read to kind of like detect that. So that's kind of where like long read is kind of like making its headway, but it still has kind of a long way to go from a cost perspective to really compete.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like we've talked for a really, really, really long time, and we should probably wrap it up. But is there anything on your mind recently that is super interesting that you've been thinking about that we haven't discussed yet?
What have I been thinking about recently?
No pressure, just wondering.
Honestly, not really. I mean, I've been thinking a lot more about liquid biopsies of this like the application layer and like how do you ascribe value to that and like can you get ahead of yourself like as all markets do where like you overpromise and end up like the outcome is still under delivering.
Well,
I've
I
been thinking
that's
about
kind of what we're seeing with the DTC companies, right? Like a lot of them offering to tell you your biological age, but that number is entirely arbitrary, and they're all just going off of blood samples that you're shipping to them. There's other liquid biopsy companies that offer much more holistic insights, right? Like what was the one we looked at? It was a big one. I forget the name now.
Natera.
Yes, Natera. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, how does Natera work exactly? They just take a blood sample, they run a bunch of tests on it, and they tell you whether or not you have cancer.
Yeah, that's kind of how like every liquid biopsy company works is like you take a blood sample and they have some sort of technology that allows them to detect basically cancer DNA. And that's kind of how they tell you if what issue they have. It depends on what they're detecting. So there's prenatal kind of screening, which is kind of like trying to get the like DNA of like a actual infant to detect if it might have like say Down syndrome or something. But like the
Mm.
more like kind of like what everyone is excited for is cancer detection because tumors kind of release like small fragments of cancer DNA. And if you can basically catch that early, you can really catch
Yeah.
cancer early. And all these companies basically have some sort of unique technology around how do you basically capture that? It's called the needle in a haystack approach because it's a small needle that gets released in your bloodstream, and you will collect it in sample blood, and they'll have some sort of unique technology. Natera has their own unique technology that kind of like catches this, and then they can kind of catch it through a sequencer. And then billion to one, similar story. They all have their unique way of doing it, but that's kind of how liquid biopsies work. It's just that the question is like, whoa, everyone's so excited about it. So what is the actual outcome that pans out?
Yeah, yeah. Much to think about. This was awesome, dude. It was good for me to ask all these clarifying questions and get a better sense of everything that we've been discussing for months.